Good evening, everyone. It's so great to see you here. I hope everyone is doing as well as they can be. I appreciate seeing everybody on Thursday night, so thanks for being here. I need to thank Dominic. Thank you so much. I'm Sarah. I'm from PPAC as well. I want to thank you so much for being here tonight and to talk about your work. I'm really excited for tonight's talk. So be sure to keep connected with PPAC, and I guess I'll go over the kind of logistics of the evening. If you have a conversation, just pop it into the chat, and we'll ask questions and communicate statements at the end. But feel free to talk there. Yeah, I don't know what else. So just lovely to see everybody, and I'm going to turn it over to Lori to introduce Dominic.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Super excited tonight. I've been waiting for this talk ever since Dominic said yes. So thank you, Dominic, for being here. I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction. Dominic Bracco II is an installation artist, documentary photographer, playwright, author, journalist, and educator. His series of multidisciplinary projects on the US Mexico borderlands earned him a 2016 Tim Hetherington Visionary Award for Innovative Media, a W. Eugene Smith Fellowship, and a National Geographic Society Explorers grant. He is also the recipient of multiple Pulitzer Center grants and a grant from the Chris Hondros Fund. His works have been displayed at festivals, galleries, and museums around the world and are part of private and institutional collections as well. Dominic's reporting has appeared in the National Geographic Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, Harper, Smithsonian Magazine, among many others. He is a founding member of the artist collective Prime. Bracco lives in Mexico City with his wife. Tonight, he will share work made on the US-Mexican border. He is interested in reframing the border as a place of contact rather than a place of separation. This is what we talked about earlier. So excited. As you can tell, Dominic is kind of a Renaissance man, and I think an incredible talent. And so I'm very excited to welcome you, Dominic. Thank you for coming here. Okay, wait, let's unmute you, babe. There we go.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
Sorry, I had to run across the quarantine zone. So for those of you who don't know, I've been a little bit under the weather, and given all the circumstances, we just figured it would be best to self-quarantine in the apartment, but now the internet seems to not be arriving in the bedroom. So hopefully everybody can hear me okay right now, right? Can you see me okay and everything? Mm-hmm. Good, okay, awesome. I miss everyone. I miss seeing other people. I feel I miss seeing my wife, and we live in the same house. Hello. I hope everyone is doing well. I know, you know, it's a weird time, and I think so many of us are feeling, you know, sort of, I don't know, maybe all of the feelings. Just there's I think there's a collective experience, a global collective experience. It's really interesting right now. So just to kind of jump into it, I've spent the last decade or so working on issues around the US-Mexico border. And I spent a lot of time covering, you know, violence and immigration and state violence, and trying to wrap my head around that. And one of the things that I feel like I'm starting to realize is that there's a problem from the beginning of the creation of the concept of the border. The border's the simple structure of the border, the existence of the border creates the environment in which we see all of these things manifesting. So right now I wanted to start actually with a series of photos that I made in 2010 around this same time. So let me just share my screen here. So I just want to start with this set of images from Ciudad Juarez that I made in 2010. And at the time I had just really started working as a professional reporter. I had lived in Washington, D.C. before that. I originally from South Texas, and I had come to Mexico and was living in Mexico already. At this point, I had been living in Mexico for about 6 months. In Juarez specifically for 6 months. And this was at the height of violence there during that time, at the sort of pinnacle moment after Calderon had launched the drug war, the war against corruption, or whatever you wanted to call it. And I had spent those 6 months looking at the gang violence, looking at the violence that was led by the Mexican state, a number of things. And I don't think it really all started to fit into the bigger picture until this one day. And it was actually the day I was leaving. I was going across the border. I was on my way to El Paso to go see some family. And I was totally burnt out, and I was going to fly to Corpus Christi to see my folks. And I was on my way to the bridge when a friend of mine gave me a call and told me that there had been a shooting. And so I came down, jumped out of the vehicle I was in, went down into to this area, which is called Puente Negro, which is a train bridge that crosses from Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, into El Paso. So what you're looking at right now is actually the family of Julian Huereca. This is him and his sister holding her baby, and his mother and some sisters and aunts. And across the way is the United States Border Patrol and police. And what had happened was there was a group of young people who were trying to cross the border when Julian was working as a halcon. He was basically watching or observing. I mean, there's many different testimonies that say what he was doing, but he was there. And when this group of people made it across, the Border Patrol responded. They started to arrest those people, and people from the Mexican side started throwing rocks across what you can see is the dry Rio Grande, which is dry because the United States takes that water away and only releases a small portion of it a few times a year. So they're chunking these rocks across, I don't know, it's about 100 meters or so. It's quite a distance. This is shot with I think a little bit of a longer lens, but the police officer, while he was arresting one of the people he had detained, picked up his weapon and fired into Mexico, exactly where they are standing in this photograph, and shot Julian Huereca, a 15-year-old Mexican boy, in the head and killed him. So that was in 2010. And since 2010, there has been over 100 Border Patrol incidents of police brutality, violence, deaths across the US-Mexico border. And those, I can share some more information about that in a bit, but there's a whole list of reasons that people have died in police custody. But there's also been multiple shootings like this case where agents have fired into Mexico. And so I was 23 years old at the time, 24, trying to wrap my head around this. I was on the Mexican side photographing and clearly heard shots come from, I am unsure, but I feel like they, I don't know, they weren't from the side I was on. I'll just put it to you that way, because I was around everyone that was armed. But as the situation started to get more heated, people were, in this one picture, sorry to go back, but in this picture, they were confronting the police, yelling at them. And then we heard shots fired. And so I continued to cover this. I sat with them. This is his mother and his sister and his little brother. The moment that he was killed, the moment that they arrived, rather, on the scene. And then I stayed and I went home with them and did the best I could to sort of understand the larger circumstance that he found himself in. He was from a very poor family, from one of the colonias that had been built after the passing of NAFTA. So after the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed, there was a large immigration from mostly southern and central Mexico, but some of the northern states, of poor agricultural families who could no longer predominantly make a living in agriculture because of lower cost subsidized corn and stuff making their way into the Mexican marketplace. They immigrated north into these cities like Ciudad Juarez, Reynosa, Tijuana, to work in manufacturing jobs in the famous maquiladoras, which are factories that assemble everything from the car seats for children to the harnesses that you find inside of vehicles to the to airline parts to the big windmills that you see all over the world, all kinds of things that we consume in the United States, so smaller consumer items, of course, as well. And most of these people earn, on average, on an entry-level job, that around 500 Mexican pesos a week, which is about $25 US a week. And those wages were closer to $100 a day when they were in the United States. So these jobs, and the people who came to work in these jobs, many of them found themselves in these very dire economic situations in which their children could no longer to afford to go to school and stuff. And that was these, what we call the famous ninis, ni estudian ni trabajan, which means neither work nor study. And those are the children, mostly predominantly the children of factory workers who, because of financial constraints, were unable to further educate their children, or because of the situation there. And all this became really exacerbated in 2010, and it continues to be sort of the rumbling that happens all over these places in Latin America, really genuinely. Looking at places like San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa, and I've seen similar trends to what I saw and continue seeing in places like Ciudad Juarez that I know quite intimately. So this last image is from his wake, and he was well loved. There was a huge turnout at his wake. He had quite a large family, and many people made it there. And I remember when we published the story, I pitched it to multiple outlets as it was happening. People seemed uninterested. The Wall Street Journal, of all places, was the first one to pick it up. And I ended up doing the reporting while they sent another reporter to El Paso. And it was one of my first experiences with like internet trolling. I didn't actually know what a troll was. I kept thinking it was funny that everybody was calling me a troll. And I was thinking, that's such a funny specific adjective to call a person. Why are they calling me a troll? I didn't know what a troll was, or an internet troll. So I was being attacked by a lot of folks and saying all kinds of crazy things. But one of the things that kept coming up in these like Twitter attacks or emails I was receiving and stuff was that Huareca was a criminal. So I was interested and did my due diligence because I know a lot of people there. So I went ahead and I looked at the situation and was really curious what his role was in this event. And it came down to me really realizing that, like, for no matter what he had done, there was no reason for another police officer to fire a weapon into a foreign country and kill someone. And I also came to understand that Huareca really was a victim of his circumstance. He was a 15-year-old boy who had been pulled in all kinds of directions, and he found himself in an unfortunate place, and it cost him his life. And I think this is what's going on with so many things right now with these institutional violence. There is a maybe human reaction to seeing, the police, these officers, or whoever we raise them up because they represent our institutional structures of our own concepts of what countries mean. I mean, they are the pillars of our individual worldviews. And I think that what happens when you see them falter, you see them make mistakes like murdering a 15-year-old boy on foreign soil, it creates a defensiveness, I think, in a lot of people. And so that I just wanted to start with that idea of defensiveness from the beginning. And this is when they buried him. So since then, he's the agent that killed him is still working. He was on the streets pretty soon after. He was further investigated later on. And there's been a number of documentaries and movements and activism based around this case. There's been I would say because of the continued violence, because of over 100 cases at this point in the last decade, there's been a consistent pressure to reevaluate these things. But the Border Patrol finds itself in this very specific, weird sort of literate space where their actions and their interactions are with non-citizens, and because they're with non-citizens, I mean, I was reading through some of the deaths. I mean, they've killed people from Congo, from all over the world. There's, and I would hear these stories from migrants about what's happening to them inside of, and this isn't even to begin to unpack the day-to-day violence that the state is pushing on immigrants as they come into the southern border of the United States. So obviously this event and in this place in my career, it left me with a great deal to try to understand as a communicator. And I spent the next 7 years or so, like looking at daily life in Ciudad Juarez, trying to understand this complex fabric that had created so much systemic violence, and understanding, like in this case, where this was a young couple where a sicario hitman had murdered these people for an extortion. This was a massacre that happened where 13 young young people were murdered, and this is the funeral for 3 young girls. This is their siblings at their funeral. And also understanding things like this young boy who was born in the United States, but then his parents were deported and he's undocumented in Mexico, unable to get an education. You know, these are the sort of images that we think of these border towns that we can see from, you know, if you're from the Southwest, you can see them while you're driving down I-10 and you see these sorts of places. And I think there's a tendency in the American imagination to be like, oh, well, poverty exists because of whatever, complacency or whatever. And I say within the I mean, obviously we're talking about a specific type of American imagination, right? But, you know, these are hardworking, factory working, like all day, like todos los días chingándole. And a lot, like in this neighborhood, there's people who work for Harley Davidson motorcycles, the Ford plant, all kinds of stuff, you know, things that we see as high value, expensive branding, but yet the workers are underpaid. And also in the middle of all of this, there is a huge narco drug war and a conflict that is very real and touches everybody's life. So I spent a ton of time reporting, telling stories, looking at daily life, looking at you know, moments that I felt, you know, would sort of contrast these sort of images of violence and give us more context to a larger thing, but also whatever included things like this of an Azteca gang member who was a prisoner who ate things like this. And over time, I started to feel, let's just skip that. Over time, I started to feel like my images, even though they're real and based in reality, we're no longer working towards deconstructing this reality that we're living in. This is my friend Lydia's home, and you know, she had blocked up the windows at the time because her neighborhood was so unsafe. And you know, you show these sort of daily life images, and you think, oh well, you know, I think the documentarian's approach is always been to highlight these issues and think, you know, what is the cause of these, and maybe if we look at these causes and roots and try to give a greater understanding, and we can have the myth of photojournalism create an empathy. So I started to self-evaluate quite a bit. I mean, I think all photographers do. I hope so. And I felt like the continuous imagery that I was participating in of violence and whatever was no longer adding to the conversation. I mean, I definitely think there was a moment in Mexican and American history where there was a denial that daily people's lives were being taken. People who were innocent civilians were being murdered because of this stupid war that we have. But then it still wasn't quite enough. And so I started to go back. I started to go back kind of to the beginning, and so I grew up in South Texas, and we're going to start with an image from Corpus Christi, Texas. This is General Zachary Taylor's army camped here in 1845 and 1846. So this is where, and you know, even within the legends and mythology of Texas, is so much inaccuracies. But you know, the Nueces River, after the war with Mexico and Texas and the República de Rio Grande and many other conflicts emerged from that era of Mexican centralism and American slavery. Like, we cannot forget that. the United States very hopefully sent the army to occupy Corpus Christi, Texas, as an effort to agitate Mexico, and over time marched them south to the Rio Grande, which is the current and modern Mexican border, but the border was already there at the Nueces River. So the response to the intrusion of American forces rather was the first battles in Palo Alto in South Texas. And so I started thinking about all this stuff, and I had a grant from National Geographic to look at this idea of fronterizo identity, which is border, frontera is border, right? So border identity, borderlands identity. And it really came down to this very clean and simple thought. And it's that, why do we consistently represent this space as a place of separation, a place of division, when really the experience of growing up there, the experience of being there, the experience of traveling through it, the experience of family, of friends, of business, is an experience of contact. It's a point of contact. The border is not just a wall where two cultures are divided like, peanut butter and jelly, and you're like adding one to two different layers of bread. And then, it's more like, when a 3-year-old tries to make it, and it's just like a big freaking smash sandwich, and you got everything blurring all which way, because the border, as we think about it, isn't even enforced within, the sort of physical limitations that were described after the Mexican-American War. The Border Patrol has a range of over 100 kilometers and miles north. So to them, to the United States as an entity, the borderlands goes up all the way up to San Antonio, Victoria, Texas, Albuquerque, New Mexico, way up to LA and California. I mean, we're talking, and culturally speaking, goes far south into Baja California Norte, Baja California Sur, Chihuahua, Sonora. And so I was interested in, what is this sort of cultural pollinization? What is the history of it? What does it mean? Is it real? Is it imagined? So like this was a battlefield in Brazos, New Mexico, of course, unmarked, one of the major skirmishes between the United States and Mexican forces. And it was basically a ragtag team of Anglo settlers from West Texas who went out looking for a fight, headed out west, and then found themselves a fight. And ironically enough, because they were on Apache land, they fought each other, and then the Apaches just attacked both parties that were leaving, of course, because they were like, what are you even fucking doing here? But continue. So, I went around New Mexico, and California and Texas, looking at these battlefields, trying to kind of understand that history of the designation of the space. Like, this is a very famous place. I'm sure many of you have seen it, maybe been there, but in Taos, New Mexico, where this cathedral, church was built by the Spanish, and this area was bombarded by the U.S. military as Hispano and indigenous Puebloan Indians were seeking refuge in the church, and hundreds of them died, women, children included. And that site is still there to this day. And so these are the kinds of stories that you don't really learn. And you also don't really learn this about like places like Chaco Canyon, which have like way BC history, that go from, these spiritual places that are so important to the Puebloan peoples and many of the First Nation peoples of the Southwest, but also have roots up into Chihuahua and the Tarahumaras and many other indigenous populations. And this is a community that we've divided, right? I mean, we know this, there's communities that literally have been cut in half. And so in sort of a very literal way, I started looking at, what happened to my other photos? Oh. In a very literal way, I started looking at Friendship Park, which I think is an interesting example of this. Friendship Park was a place that was meant to be a place, a point of greeting, a place where families could meet, a place where if you're from San Diego and your family's from Tijuana or wherever, they could come together and hang out and spend time in this very large, beautiful oceanside park. Over time, as people began to use the park for a point of smuggling, they slowly restricted the limitations on the use of the park. So as first it was like, the 70s or 80s, they built, some of the first infrastructure there, built, you were only allowed to do certain things at the park. It was like consistent and more policing, which is something that I think is just to continue to come back to, is that like mega state policing. So if you look now at this picture, which is a wedding between a woman who is from Mexico, her husband who's from the United States, but because she doesn't have papers to go to the United States, and because he had caught some drama with the law and was unable to go to Mexico, they decided to get married like this, which I thought was really a beautiful moment. I actually stumbled upon this. This was lucky. But this little grid of fence you can see between the slats was placed in there because people were passing objects through the fence. So now the only human interaction you can get is literally the tip of your pinky fits. So you can touch another person's pinky. And people go to this park and they sit there and they set up their little umbrellas and they hang out and they have like little picnics and they talk to their families. On Sundays, when the United States allows people to get close to the border wall on their side, because on Mexico it's painted, it's vibrant, there's a park there, you can hang out, it's completely free. On the United States side, you have to be escorted. There's like all this like hoops you have to go through. And many people, because of DACA and other immigration, entanglements that they find themselves in, have been, unable to visit family members for years and years and years. So this is their only way of doing that. But they also put themselves in incredible risk often because they have to report themselves to the police just to go up to see somebody through a metal wall. And there's everything. People go up and they just want to see what the other side is. This is another family talking to some friends of theirs. But I just found like these images to be, to me, just beautiful in a way, these moments rather, not trying to toot my own horn here that the pictures are great, but I think that the moments are beautiful because they're like, despite all of this infrastructure and policing and stuff, people are still finding a way to find each other. And I'm gonna forget his name right now, but I recently was listening to an interview with a Fronterizzo artist, writer, and he was talking about how much he thinks people miss each other. And I feel like that's such a good thing to think about right now, where we all really do miss each other. My mom is sitting here and she can tell you, but I asked her recently, when was the first time I went to Mexico? And she said, well, when I was in her belly. And I've had a consistent, long lifetime relationship with Mexico. Part of my father's ancestry comes from Mexico, northern Mexico. They were some of the first settlers, that moved up from northern Mexico to settle the Rio Grande Valley. And they were there since it was, part of Mexico. Essentially, that part of Texas was part of Mexico. So there's always been, you know, and many of his cousins and family members and stuff had married with other family members, other families rather, that are from that region or northern Mexico. So there had always been in our family a sort of closeness, I guess you could say, with the space. And it's tragic, but I think, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if most of my family, with the exception of my close intimate family, because I live in Mexico and I've been here for the last 11 years, have, you know, they've stopped coming because of the violence and all these things. And I feel like so much of it has to do with the way that we designed the border. And I think it starts from the beginning, and we have to remember that the United States-Mexico border is the modern day manifestation of the colonial Western expansion of Manifest Destiny. That was a genocidal war against Native peoples, Hispanos, Tejanos, whatever, not that they are without their guilt, because they also did it, but in their way west, tried to create this erasure. And I think that our modern politics are continuously on display. It's like they're continuously rather displaying the legacy, that legacy specifically. And it's our lack of awareness of that that makes these things continue to manifest. So let's jump now to some happy stuff. Anyway, so the title of this talk is Fronterizx As Fuck, and, you know, a place where two countries touch each other. I feel like we should be celebrating this stuff, and I feel like the stories of people like this man who moved from another part of the United States to El Paso, Texas, and found himself living. He's a veteran. Found himself living in El Paso because it was affordable for him. He's retired. He goes to the doctor in Juarez. He goes once a week to have a drink at his favorite cantina. He's like a super kind man, lives in this building that is loaded with Mexican immigrants who are studying at UTEP. So he's got like, it's like him, he's like in his 60s. He looks super young. He's in his 60s, but it's him and all of these young 20-something-year-olds living in this building. And he's just like living the life that he wants to live. And it's on the border, but these are the kinds of stories that we never show, these sorts of stories that show us how to live. And so I made a series of pictures as I was traveling that I felt like were really less about the issues and really more about just who we are. Like, what is it that we are? We're hardworking people. We're a hardworking people. That is hands down a trait that is fundamental from east to west, thousands and thousands of miles. And you could argue that the creation of the border itself is part of the reason that we have that unique and unifying experience. You know, that the border itself, the structure of the border itself, the customs, all the stuff that surrounds it is what has created a new sort of identity. And so I just wanted to do something that felt like a celebration of that. So this is Los Fronterizos, which is basically, you know, my take on who we are. And so I, you know, meet people like this guy's from New Mexico, speaks only Spanish, and his grandson obviously speaks English, but I found that to be really interesting, near one of the battlefields. and then you come across people like this who find themselves living in the border, who are refugees from, you know, horrific situations in Central America, that are also part of the same legacy of colonial past and history. And I think it's important to remember that people have been moving through this space from Mesoamerica up into what we could call the American Southwest for thousands of years. Like, this isn't like what we've done by creating this militarized border is try to stop a natural movement that has been happening for centuries. This is the first openly gay candidate in Chihuahua. She was working for the Morena Party, and this is her and her wife. Very lovely people. And there's also, you know, these wonderful signs of resistance as well on the border, because it is a pollinization place. It's a place of ideas and exchange. You know, some of these women had gone to study in the United States and been influenced by civil rights movement, like this young boy he's a student in El Paso. So there's you know, there's these important sort of resistance concepts and ideas, I think, that are also important. Hey, sorry, my dog is a pain. So I'm going to leave it at that, because I'm sure people have questions, and I would love to open it up with for that and turn this into like a little bit more of a discussion for the last bit. So I don't know if you guys want to type in stuff into the comments, and then maybe Lori or somebody could read them, and then we could chat about them a little bit more.
Thanks, Dominic. That was
I'll just leave these
wonderful.
running.
I wanted to see, leave the happy ones up, like leave it there.
Yeah,
Leave it
I'm
there.
going to leave them running. I'm sorry.
There is a comment from our Sanders. Gloria Anzaldúa has written on Borderlands La Frontera, the new mestiza, not fully of Mexico, not fully of the United States. Her argument is interesting. I don't know if you want to continue on that thought.
Well, I love her. She's been a huge influence on my work. I was really sad to find out that, you know, she wasn't somebody that I could seek out when I had found her work, because she has been, I think, fundamental in understanding how borders shape identities, and how also, like, I think it's so important for us to remember, and I feel like right now, because of the virus, we're there, but it's so important for us to remember that everything that we think of as concrete when we're talking about institutions, and these are moving really fast. When we're thinking about institutions and you know, governments, countries, banks, whatever, name it, they're all figments of our collective imagination, right? So the United States was a dream of a few people, and that a dream has been adopted by generations. And I think it's important. One of the things I don't think I really understood was that so much of our societal progress has really been the resistance to the state, rather than, you know, when you think about like feminism and the right to vote for women and all the things that we celebrate as great and pillars of American culture, came about because of people's resistance to the state, and they had the gumption to challenge the authority and say, this is not what we want, and that created some spaces that were better, and, you know, and it's been a continuous fight, and that resistance has been important. But I also feel like it's so important for us, for other people, white males or whoever you are, specifically those who hold up these institutions, to be a little bit more passive. I don't understand really why don't we have conversations that are more open to, like in The Great Mestiza, or in like her concepts that she presents in that book, where she talks about, basically how she is, and I think there's a very beautiful moment in the book. Let me see, maybe I can grab it, but she's talking about how she is like kneading, she describes it as like kneading bread, or like kneading, masa or something. And it's like that, like you're taking culture, and she talks about how, as a queer woman, as a feminist, she's not really upholding any sort of indigenous Hispano, like Latino shit either. Like she's on her own thing. She's trying to create her own path forward, because that was written in like 1980 something. So, I mean, I think I feel like that part of this like imagined community and like whatever is it's so important for us to be more internally passive in the way that we receive these kinds of, when people resist the state, we should be more passive in listening to them, and I think, that's happening right now because of the coronavirus. I think because people, for the first time in a long time, have had they've had the mental space, because they don't have, I love this guy, Vatos Locos, because they have the mental capacity for the first time, or space rather, just to like not be worried about all these other things that they need to buy, that we've been told that we need to buy. I love this family too, the Mormon family from Chihuahua. So I think, yeah, I don't know if there was a question in there about that book, but definitely was a huge influence on my work, for sure.
Well, I think it's noted. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because now I'm going to look for this author and this work.
Yeah.
I have more questions than that, but I'm going to read someone else's. Patricia wrote, "This is a large subject. Was this overwhelming to develop, and how long did it take you to decide on the ideas that you wanted to cover? And did you decide to leave some ideas to the side?"
That's a great question. It's an ongoing concept. I think for me, my work has shifted. So what I'm mostly interested in now, this was I call it an investigation. I spent 2 years reading a ton and traveling as much as I could to these places to talk to people about this idea. And I would ask them, do you identify with this? Is this nonsense? Like, what does the word fronterizo mean to you? Is that something that you actually think is real? Do you think border culture is a real thing? And overwhelmingly, people were acceptant of it. They were like, yeah, things are different in this part of Mexico or the United States than they are in the interior of the country, either side. It's without a doubt, freaking Harlingen, Texas is way different than, whatever small town in Pennsylvania, and that's because of the Chicano, reality and the history, cowboy culture and all that stuff. And I think that, so these concepts were fucking hard. Yes. I had a lot of moments where my mom's telling me to stop cussing, where I had a lot of moments where I was very, 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 very confused. One, because I am a mixed race person and I'm a white passing male, and I am a white male. I don't say I'm not a white male, but I did have a lot of internal conflict as to like trying to know if I was trying to create a space where I fit in. And that was something troubling to me. I didn't want, when I was at the beginning, I was very hesitant to be, on the verge of appropriating something or creating a body of work that was basically my own imaginary concept. But I had to go out and start looking at things and talking to people to see if it was real. There's Macata, Talia. Because I wanted to know how people felt about this. And I also started to realize that one of the things I was doing along the way was I was planting these seeds of like, hey, have you ever thought about this? Like, do you know the history of where you're from? Do you know the history of your town? And people would be like, oh yeah, hold on, let me dig up this old family album or whatever and tell me all this stuff. And so where I've come to now is that I'm working on trying to sort of needle a thread through my work and the work of many, many other artists, not just photographers, but different kinds of artists. And that's still very much in the conceptual phase. But the idea is to create a campaign to start including the word fronterizo into the North American lexicon, into the US American lexicon. And because it exists here in Mexico in a real way. I mean, there's tons of songs about it and food and everything. You think about, if you're like, what is fronterizo culture? Okay, well, have you ever had a margarita? Yes. Okay, well, that's from Juarez. Like, do you like nachos? Okay, those are from freaking northern Coahuila. Do you like, anything? Do you like, it's like all these things that we think about. Caesar salad, whatever. I mean, food to name a few, but Juan Gabriel, freaking Selenas from Corpus Christi, all these like wonderful people who have done these amazing things with culture because of the border, because of the proximity to the border, because of the existence of this space. And we don't celebrate that as media makers. I mean, okay, I had it. I'm not going to say we don't, because there's been a legacy of many people who have. But specifically coming from the work of a documentarian, I think your role is to look at the world, not to influence the world so much. And so I've had to step out of that a bit in this specific space, because I feel like there's a huge like hueco in the way that we cover this stuff, because we are so issue focused. Often I feel like all we do is chase our own tail around in a circle by highlighting the same things, and we're not showing paths forward. We're not representing stories that give people a way to think about, what do we want the next 100 years to look like? I mean, I think if you ask anybody, even the most conservative person who's, feeling staunch in their stubbornness, would probably agree that they don't like the fact that the United States is killing people on the border, that hundreds of migrants die every year in freaking South Texas as they're trying to get through the desert. A lot of people don't even understand that they're doing that in Texas. Even people in Texas don't even understand that. You go to Dallas. I remember I went to school in Arlington at the north of the state, and I would tell people about this kind of stuff, and they would be like, what? You don't have to tell people to bring a passport down so we could go to the beach, things like that. And, there's these, I don't know. Sorry, I'm just on a rant. Anybody else want to ask a question?
So there's one question here, and I'm going to, the thing that I love about the idea of working with all kinds of artists is the seed that you want to plant about the concept of fronteriza. And
no, I need to plug it. I had to move, sorry.
Okay.
Shit. Need power.
Plug it into mine.
Where is yours though? Sorry.
Are you plugged in?
Out of the office. Contaminating everything.
So yeah, I like that idea. Are you plugged in?
Yeah.
Yay. All right. So Ricky asks, do you think about your subject position and the fact that you're a white male who gets to be safe when taking these photographs?
Like in terms of covering situations that are dangerous? Or... Oh, wait, do I think about my subjects? I don't understand what that question means.
You think about your subject position. Subject's position. Ricky, you want to, I think it's Ricky. Do you want to come in and ask a question? Or do you want to just keep typing? She might be typing, but we can come back to it.
Yeah.
I was kind of, oh.
Yep.
Yes, in terms of covering the material and the terms of how you see.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. Of course, yeah. I think about subject safety in a way that I learned that lesson in a way that's real. So in 2013 or 14, I can't even remember right now, but I was working on a story for the Washington Post. And in the course of our reporting, I was working more as a fixer for that story. And I found a family for people to, let me just take this off so you can just see me. So I met this family, a guy who had been involved in crime, and then he was out to the defensa and was working, basically fighting against the cartels in his community. But then he started highlighting some issues that had come up within his organization that he was working with, trying to fight against the narcos. And him and his entire family were murdered. And they were murdered not only because of the story. He had done a number of things, and after further investigation, I found out that, anyways, I'm not gonna jump into the whole weeds right now, but I understand that this isn't a fucking game, and I'm not playing around with it either. And I wasn't then, but I definitely was a much younger photographer with the sort of editorial pressures that come with, declining budgets in the new media market. So you have to turn things around quickly, and there's less space for contemplation and conversation. And I speak about that openly because it's a lesson that I hope nobody ever has to learn. And I hope that no one ever has to go through that again. But yes, I think about the fact, I think that the foreign press in Mexico specifically has a different role to play because we run a different risk than a lot of locally publishing journalists. Like if you're writing in Ciudad Juarez and doing stuff that they have, not that they don't, a lot of them do because they're brave, but we do have a different reality. That's changing though. A friend of mine was shot last year. It's just like, if you're talking about specifically about that, is that what the question was more specifically about like my subject safety? I didn't quite, or maybe I read that wrong. I don't know.
Well, I think, Ricky, let me know if there's an additional question, but I do, because I've known you probably since 2015. I do know that, you've sort of backed away from the everyday journalism stuff, trying to make some more in-depth and collaborative pieces.
Yeah, I think I always have. In a way, what ended up happening is I went back to the way I started. I realized that, so some of the most important work to me, and I stand by today, is the work that I've done and continuously am doing in Ciudad Juarez. Right now I'm working on a film, a fiction film that talks a lot about things that I could not ever imagine to describe with a series of photographs. And because of the necessity of making a living, I was an editorial assignment photographer. So even though I had these personal projects and endeavors that I was looking at really in depth and have real long-standing relationships with people, they came to my wedding, for God's sake. These are not just anybody. These are people who I love. The people that I've shown you in some of these photographs, I care about really deeply. but then there was a moment in my career where, you know, I was becoming more successful in terms of my assignment coverage or whatever, what have you. But really, I was just trying to survive. I was trying to pay the bills, pay rent, and do things. But I got frustrated with the, you know, 2-day assignments because I just felt like I was mining stories, and I just don't want to do that. I don't feel comfortable doing that. I don't know how much that has to do specifically with my whiteness, but I'm sure it does. I mean, I just don't feel comfortable running into a space and not getting to know somebody and just like sticking my camera in their face. But I still have to do it sometimes because I have to eat, you know, and so I try to do that in the best way possible. But none of that work I'm really proud of. It's just like what I do. I don't really show it, you know. I do my best. I bring it, you know, I bring it my all, but I wouldn't call that like my work, you know. It's just, that's work I do. I mean, to me, that's like, you know, changing oil in my Vocho. So.
It's 8 o'clock and we try to keep this to an hour. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I really want to hear more about what's going to happen to the portraits of it that you've made along the border, but maybe we can catch up in the future.
Yeah.
But
well, thanks so much for having this conversation. I think it's an important time for us to rethink, really, you know, I mean, the Border Patrol is something that needs to be re-examined in a serious way. You know, it was founded on a legacy of racism. I mean, some of their first jobs were to keep out Asian immigrants from the country when there was the anti-Asian laws. There was, you know, a lot of the first Border Patrol agents were the sons of former slaveholders from the South who had lost their wealth in the Deep South and went west because they needed to make a name for themselves. And of course, unfortunately, some of them carried with them some of those, you know, harsher things. That doesn't mean that everybody's a piece of shit. Like, you know, I have a cousin that's a Border Patrol agent, you know. I mean, I'm not going to say that he's not great, but he's, you know, there are people in there, like tons of Latinos, tons of, you know, folks out there that like believed in the cause for whatever reason, or because they lived in Harlingen, Texas and Laredo and they didn't have another job opportunity, a lot of vets or whatever. I mean, they found themselves in the system that we built. And it's time now, I think, to like really think about like, what are we doing? What is the point of this? Like when we're allocating so much money, you know, billions of dollars that could be spent on, and then they think, you know, when people go off on these things about how immigrants fail in societies, it's like, well, no wonder, because you do nothing to help them. All you do is criminalize them the entire way. So why wouldn't they become criminals? Or why wouldn't they? Not that they do, because the statistics show they don't, but it's infuriating, you know? And I think we're at the point now where people are starting to ask these questions, and I think it's exciting. I think it's, and I do feel like we're moving towards a space because of the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the work that those people have been doing and all the work that, you know, like our ancestors have been doing for, you know, generations. I feel like we're coming to a head like right now, and our generation just isn't going to put up with this shit anymore. We don't want to live in a society that's so sick. You know, we like, I care about other people, and I know a lot of my, you know, friends and colleagues do. And so I think it's time for us to self-evaluate as well. Like, how do I, as a journalist, like, how am I playing into these systems? Like, all of us need to sit down and do the work. This is the time to do it. And, you know, anyways, that's the end of my spiel. So
thank you. There's some nice thoughts in the chats and some appreciative ideas.
Oh, awesome. Thank you guys.
Thanks so much coming from Mexico, Dominic. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. I wish that we had a little bit more time for some conversations. This felt very, very short tonight, but I'm so glad everybody could join us.
Feel free to email me if you have ideas or thoughts or want to collaborate or think I'm crazy and want to tell me that I'm going the wrong direction. I'm open.
That's true. That's true. Next week, Sasha Ferris-Burgess and Zora Murph are going to have a conversation about citizenship. So please come back next week, next Thursday. It's going to be another great night. Dom, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, everyone. Sarah, do you want to say anything?
No, just thanks for everyone for being here. Don said earlier, we miss seeing people. So opportunities like this to see people, even if it's on screen, is better than nothing. So I appreciate you taking the time, and all of you for being here. And I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Feel better.
Yeah, thanks.